are live. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is another narrator here on the show. Now, if you remember this guest from my other show, Into the Maze, this guest needs no introduction. He is an incredible narrator specializing in a wide range of genres. I am so excited to have him here on the show. He's incredibly talented, his work is impeccable, and he is also great friends with other narrators who have been on the show, Mariana, Daphne, Amber, and so forth. And potentially, you may see this guest in a future project of mine down the road. I'll say that at the end of the video. But without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, my good friend, Mr. Dameon Knight. Dameon, welcome to the show.
Hi, Gabriel. How are you doing today? Thanks for having me back here on your show this time. And hello to all the listeners and viewers.
Awesome, Dameon. I am so excited to have you here on the show. And honestly, I can't wait to ask you some of these questions, especially some of the fan questions, because I think these are going to be really, really fun. But before we get into that, let's, for our viewers here, as a little refresh, what can you tell them about your background in the work of narration and voiceover work?
Sure thing. So I come to the narration world not through like any like performing arts or acting or anything like that, but I started streaming somewhere around 2019, somewhere around there, and I worked for esports org doing casting in terms of like shoutcasting for their weekly games, and then I worked into a little bit of commercial voiceover. And then decided that wasn't really my thing. I've done some audio engineering. I still do that occasionally. But I really like long form, storytelling in terms of like thrillers, romance and fantasy and things along those lines. So that's kind of my background. I do, traditionally I come from tech. So I do have a strong tech background as well.
Nice. And almost like we talked on the other podcast, what are some of the most recent works you've been a part of? Because I also remember that you've done some duet narrations with some of our friends mentioned in the introduction.
Sure, yeah. So let's see. Earlier this year, we started a 4-book series. It's a romantasy called The Chord. Well, I was in The Chord Between Us. It's all of them, actually. But it's the Shadow Dragon series by Lee Fields. And that's a full cast. I think there's about 8 or 10 narrators in that one. And so we have like the female main character and the main male character per book. And then those characters, as they're introduced throughout the series, carry over to each book. So I'm in all 4 books as well as, the main male character in the first book. Let's see, what other books have we done? I've done some thrillers throughout the year. Beth Curry, Daniel Maldonado. Duet recently was This Must Be the Place for Beth Curry. She does psycho thrillers. Did that one in duet with Daphne Winters. So that was quite fun. A unique thing. I don't think a lot of like thrillers or psycho thrillers are narrated in duet. I mean, there are a few out there, but usually those are solo narration. So I've done that. Just a few smaller romance projects. I've got, probably can't talk about that one yet. There's a pretty big one that just had the Kickstarter yesterday. But several other projects, either in production that are like, either in approval with Audible or being mixed by, the production team. And then I've got a book, that one was released with Sammy Rowe. I think you had her on your podcast previously as well. Yeah, so we start that one here probably later this month for Parks. It's called The Knowing Witch. And that's going to be interesting. I don't think I've narrated a fantasy with witches and magic and stuff like that in terms of that. I've done like dragons and stuff, but that'll be an interesting one. And my first time working with Sammy as well. We've done
Nice.
some like shorts and things like that for some of our authors as well, but this will be a full, like 10-hour production or something like that. We're doing that one in duet as well. So
Awesome. Awesome. That's incredible.
yeah, it's
And
pretty exciting.
also, huge shout out to all the people mentioned from Sammy, Daphne, and all those stories. To check an eye out for those when those release. And
Sure.
I've had an opportunity to listen to more of your work
Mhm.
on either through like Audible samples or through your own social media. And I'm blown away by your approach to your
Thank you.
characters, which leads to the first fan question, Dameon. And this
Sure, bring it.
question is, how do you develop your approach to the characters? What I mean by that is, the author, of course, will tell you this is the character you're playing, give you the history of them, the backstory. But how do you develop them as a character in terms of their voice, who they are, so that way they're not generic, but they have their authenticity to them?
Sure, that is a great question. And every narrator is different how they kind of
Mhm.
approach this. You probably have heard that on some of your other shows. For me, the big input is from the author. I like to get an idea of, who in their mind was this when they wrote this character. And
Mm.
I tend to think spatially. So I like to know personally, like, are they tall? Are they short? Are they, average build? Are they muscular? What do they look like in the physical world? And a lot
Right.
of authors have like, they'll have artwork commissioned.
Mhm.
So that helps out in understanding, who this character actually is. Because, the description in words is great, but sometimes like being a visual person, I like to kind of see that. And that helps me understand, okay, this character might be a little bit snarky, or
Right.
this character might be more deadpan serious, or
Mm.
this character is from like the thrillers and the spy stuff that I work on. This is like a military person, or a spy person, or a person in command.
Right.
And all those characters have different types of like voices that they, in my mind, think that they
Right.
should have. Um, and the next thing I'll do is I'll kind of like read through portions of the book, and I might get some flack from this, but I don't typically read the entire book. And I know for some narrators, their big process for prep is to like read the whole thing all the way cover to cover. And my justification on that is I typically will read, maybe like a quarter to a third of the book, just so I get a general idea of the
Right.
character interactions and how everybody is moving, and just the world itself. And I stop at that point because I don't really want
Mm.
to spoil it for myself.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm pretty particular about that. I don't really like to know the ending of the story unless I need to for performance reasons.
Right.
And then what I'll do is take all that knowledge, form in my mind what they look like, and then that allows me to know exactly like what they sound like. And for random characters, I kind of like have a set of like 2 or 3 generic voices that I'll use. But like for dedicated characters, I really like to know just how they appear, because I associate that with the voice itself. And then I can inflect differently, maybe, slur words when I'm saying it. Don't
Right.
speak as clear or as
Mm.
articulately, because some of those characters may not speak that way. And again, just remembering what they
Absolutely.
look like and having like a character list from the author helps out as well. But that's my general process.
Nice. That's actually very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And if you also think of it in another way, it's almost like with for actors in general,
Mhm.
when they're given a script of the character, and all the lore dumping, because you do want the actors, the voiceover artists, to have as much intel of the character to give the best performance. But as we'll touch on later, sometimes you have to trust the voice artist to add their own unique flair to the characters that the author may not have considered.
Yeah.
And whenever you're a part of a new project, Dameon, for whichever genre that you're working in, ultimately, what is your goal and promise, not only to yourself, but also to the author as well as the other narrators that you'll be working on, whether it's you and another author in a duet or a team of narrators?
Sure. Yeah. So my promise, my philosophy is I always want to offer my best performance possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, for my co-narrators, that is for the author, obviously, and then ultimately for the listeners, everybody ingesting the audiobook media, is to offer that best performance, but really just like stay out of the way of the script.
Right.
I don't want to impart too much of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I find if I do too much, meaning I'm like, full sending the best performance, if you will, then that can affect, number one, it can affect the co-narrators, because
Mm.
especially if we're doing like a live duet session, because sometimes, I don't know how familiar you are with duet, but sometimes we do narrate live
Right.
with one of the other narrators or like the cast,
Mm.
because that allows everybody to kind of like, play off each other. But if I go over the top too much and try and give them like my best performance, that affects them as well. And then the
Yeah.
listeners, that shows up in the listeners where it's just like fatiguing to listen to. So there is the best performance possible, but also stay out of the way, because I'm just here to like convey the words that the author, as an author
Mm.
yourself, you have a message that you want to like tell people. And Ray Porter is one of my idols, and I tend to like to talk
Yes.
about that. That's his philosophy as well. And I thought it was interesting when I heard him say that. I'm like, well, that kind of like made sense to me. That's what I was doing already. So it's good to have like professional backup on that. But really just get out of the way. Let your story be told, because that's doing your story the honor that it deserves.
Mm-hmm.
And honoring the listeners too, because they're paying a good amount of money. Some of these books are, you might pay $5. You might pay, I don't know, $50 for an audiobook.
Yep.
It can get quite expensive. So, don't overdo it, but make sure you still give the right performance. That's my thought on that.
Absolutely. And also kind of add to that,
Mhm.
even though I myself not a narrator, but I have seen and heard a lot of interviews of people in the narration world as well as the voiceover industry
Mhm.
where they, say the exact same thing, Dameon, where especially if it's in like in a booth, like a group booth, you do want to play off each other's energy to where it's, organic, there's a chemistry, but you don't want to ever um over exceed or showboat. If it's
Mhm.
like in your own booth, if it's just you, then you do have that creative freedom to, make those exaggerations, especially if it's like in a tussle or a fight, then yes, go all out. But if it's in a group booth, then you have to be mindful of, okay, there are other people in the room. I want to give my good performance, but also I got to make sure that they can feel my energy, they get a good idea of how I'm seeing this character, especially if it's like, as an example, you and Daphne are in a recording booth and you are, let's say, are playing two characters that are having a conversation. You want it to feel organic and not just reading off the script, because I'm sure you will have some thoughts on this, Damien, that reading off a script is very easily noticeable as opposed to just glancing down it, but just saying the dialogue as authentic as possible.
Yes, absolutely. And that is one of the things on that subject of, reading versus like actually acting or performing
Mm-hmm.
is as a, I'm still like a baby narrator. I've only been in this, like I said, since 2019 doing voiceover, but narration roughly since around late 2023. So I'm pretty new comparatively to like the business standards, but you come up to speed rather quickly. But that is one
Right.
thing when you're a newer narrator, it's real easy to slip into that reading the words off the page and just
Yes.
saying the words but not getting the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to you have to break that habit, especially like you referenced in like a duet or multicast situation, because those
Mm-hmm.
people, everybody's coming in trying to be the best in the business for themselves, for the listeners, for the authors, for their co-narrators. And you just don't want to like kind of like deliver that line too flat. You don't want to
Yes.
deliver it flat as a board.
Mhm.
It just doesn't come out proper.
Yes, that is very true. That is ultimately very true. Now, let's talk about your first work that you've done in narration. When you began that project, what was the feedback you got, firstly, from the author after listening to your initial audition,
Mhm.
and then also from friends and family who possibly may have bought the audiobook and listened to your performance?
Sure. Okay. So story time, I guess. So the first book I did under my regular like non-romance pseudonym.
Mhm.
And I'll tattle on myself just because I think this is an important learning aspect for everyone involved.
All
Because
right.
I know seasoned narrators and like newer narrators are going to be reading or listening to the podcast here. One of the first things I received after the author was like, "Oh, hey, your audio is really clear, and I like the way you speak and articulate. So here's the project." And I said, "Okay, great." And it was a nonfiction project. Um, Turned in the 15 minutes, and at that point, I was pretty new, and it kind of falls back into that reading the words off the page instead of
Mm,
actually telling the story. And
right.
even in nonfiction, we still have to tell the story.
Yes.
So the author was like, "Hey, can you act a little bit more excited and like, upbeat about this? I know it's like dull, stuff, but act a little bit more excited." And I was like, okay, that's a good point. So that was like the first feedback I ever got. And I immediately
Mm,
switched, I was like, okay, I see where I need to go. So I was able to correct that immediately. And the author was like extremely pleased by the end of that. The reviews on that one were pretty positive. Everybody enjoyed that. Um, One of the next projects I worked on, I did several thrillers back to back, and those have all received, praise. Everybody enjoyed those. The number of voices, I typically do a lot of voices on thrillers.
ooh,
And so there was feedback from like people that, they enjoyed having all the different voices. Um, and just the storytelling in general was really good. Um, I tend to not read a lot of reviews just because I don't want to see what people say, but I
right.
do skim them, just to make sure that I'm understanding, and people feel different about this. Some people like to read the reviews, some people don't like to read the reviews. I kind of use that as like a gauge of like what is going on. Like,
Right.
do I need to improve on anything? And I mean, if you're a Redditor or anybody on social media, you know how to filter like the garbage. So
Mhm.
I have a pretty good filter for all the stuff that's like too negative. Um, but I don't. Everybody's been pretty positive about everything. All the authors I've ever worked with, the number one comment I received back, and I think all narrators and can relate to this one, is I appreciated the interpretation. I never thought that would be interpreted that way. And you kind of touched on that
Mhm.
previously, where you mentioned, that's the narrators. It's kind of up to us to interpret the story to some
Yeah.
extent, and the characters. And everybody's always been appreciative of that. And
Mhm.
that's one thing I want to convey to folks is, when you're giving it your best, that kind of feedback is really important because it means that you've touched someone emotionally during your read.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah.
That's a very, very true, Damon. That is very, very true. And another fan question we have is, what do you think, in your opinion, are the most challenging aspects of being a narrator? And add on to this, how do you overcome what I like to call the narrator's block? Almost like with writer's block, how we as writers will be in a stump
Mhm.
and we're struggling with writing. I wonder if that's the same thing for narrators in terms of either getting your pitch right, if you're doing expository narration, or the voice right for a certain character.
Yeah. So let's go. How do we answer this? This is a two-part question, but it could be summarized. Give me the first part one more time, summary. I
Of
was
course.
listening, trying to pay attention to both.
Of
This is
course.
so good.
So the first part of the question is, in your opinion, what is the most challenging
Yeah.
part of being a narrator?
Okay. The most challenging part of being a narrator is actually both of those.
Ah,
For
okay.
me, it's my interpretation of that, it is extremely challenging to ensure that you're interpreting the characters correctly. The tech aspect for me, I mean, like I said, I've done audio engineering before. I do audio engineering, so the tech is completely out of the way for myself.
Right.
So I don't have to worry about that. A lot of people struggle with the tech. So let's just strike that one out completely. And the tech meaning like the recording space, the equipment, the software, the whole nine. The actual performance itself is the difficult part, because on the first part of the question, it's interpreting the character properly.
Right.
And then on the second part of the question, it's beating myself up for not interpreting it in my mind properly. So I'm constantly fighting that battle of understanding, am I getting this right? Is this really what the author intended? Because their story is what I'm trying to tell. And then beating myself up, I'm not getting that character correct, and having to kind of go back and do it over again. It's like, it's a yin and a yang. It's a constant battle for me to try and like balance those two, because I want to like spend all the time in the world doing that, but I also don't want to spend all the time in the world, because then that chews up time trying to get the production completed. Hopefully that makes sense and answers kind of the question. I know
Yes.
it's a unique perspective. That's just that's how I feel every day. Every time I sit down in the booth here, that's how I'm always feeling. Okay, let's give the best performance, but let's not waste too much time.
Absolutely. And would you say that's also how you overcome your narrator's block, in the sense of, there are maybe some days where you may be struggling with, some character voices, or, again, expository dialogue, or just some other aspect of narration?
Yeah, and just kind of like the overcoming of it is, it's just sheer determination. Just like, you just have to stop. The narrator's block, for me, and probably for a lot of people, might be like an imposter syndrome.
Yes.
The imposter syndrome is constantly feeding into that, which can cause the block, where you're just like, I can't seem to nail this line. I can't seem to nail this character. The imposter syndrome is constantly working in and around all of that. And you just have to just shut it out. Know that you're doing excellent. The author picked you for a reason.
That is very true. That is very, very true.
Yeah, and oftentimes they probably got feedback from their assistants and maybe their street team. Maybe they shared your audition with them and everybody weighed in on it. I've had that happen several times, where like the author posted on Facebook and he's like, hey, I'm choosing this person here to narrate the book. These other 2 or 3 people are in the running. What do you guys think? And, everybody weighs in, or the PAs plus, the rest of the street team.
Yes.
It could be just everybody. You've been selected for that job, and you have to remind yourself of that to kind of get over that narrator's block of, hey, you're doing okay. The choices you make are okay.
Very, very true. And I also want to touch on what you said about, imposter syndrome, because I think it is very, very true, especially now in the digital age. And this is almost what we touched on in the other show, Into the Maze, is that before the rise of social media, narrators, voiceover artists, actors, they all gave their tapes and their auditions, almost like in a very one-on-one experience. But as we've reached to the digital age, it's a double-edged sword, where yes, we can, and by we I mean, of course, narrators in particular, you're able to share your work with a wide range of people, not just the people who are employing you, but also your fans, your followers, to showcase your talents and gain new projects to work on. But on the other side, just like with authors and editors, I imagine for narrators, you guys have probably received your own fair share of negativity, hate speech, trolls, all of that stuff. And that can be very detrimental to a narrator's overall mental health and well-being. And I think you've already answered this before, but maybe you can go in depth, Dameon. In those particular scenarios, how do you handle very negative feedback or harsh critique, either from your performance or just snippets that you posted on your social media, or just in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. You always have good questions here because they're important for everybody. And I think it applies just for like authors as well.
Mm-hmm.
But from a narrator standpoint, again, I try not to look at too many comments. But I do, again, I have a pretty strong filter from just being online for too many years, chronically online, I guess you could say. So I filter most of that out. But if it's like the general public commenting negatively, I may not take that as like seriously as perhaps maybe feedback from a particular author or a co-narrator or a fellow narrator, somebody in the business that understands what's going on. Because not everybody understands, and I'd like, the general public to understand that more, is we're just doing the best we can. I
Yes.
mean, we're stuck in this room, the padded room, as everybody calls it, and we're typically alone. So we're trying to, some people have a struggle with that. Other people are more comfortable in these environments, but we're just doing the best we can in that space at that moment in time.
Absolutely.
And how that comes out once it goes into the microphone through everything and comes out the other end is really, that's our best performance at that time. And everybody improves over time. If you really want to listen to yourself and not be down on yourself and kind of like fight those trolls online, listen to your very early works and then go and listen to your current works. And you're going to hear like a dramatic difference. It's physically not possible to have the same performance as you did when you started. You're always improving. Everybody's always trying to improve. So take that, embrace that. Don't allow it to like consume you. Don't allow the trolls to consume you. Think about that moment. That's how I personally handle all those types of situations. Hey, I recorded that, 2 years ago. That was me then. This is me now. It's not even the same thing. Any positivity, you need to like embrace that, because that's really what matters, especially when it's feedback from fellow narrators and authors, for sure.
100%. And this kind of goes into a fun question, which I want to ask you, Dameon. And I think I've asked you this on the other show, but I've had a better time to refine it, which is, as you mentioned before, you began in the voiceover industry back in 2019, but the world of narration is still fairly new to you, and you're still learning, as I was saying before. So, as you mentioned earlier, Dameon, you began the work of narration very early, but you began voiceover work a little earlier, back in 2019, around the height of the quarantine era, the lockdown era. And I've been asking this question with a lot of people, editors, authors, narrators, to hear their thoughts on this from those years into what I call the post-COVID years, because we've all changed from those 4 years. We've all learned to grow. And this is basically the question whether or not we're in a golden age, renaissance, or pseudo dark age. And I'll give my reasons why. Now, for people who have argued that we are in a golden age, they argue that there's an influx of independent creators, editors, authors, a lot of narrators, which is incredible to see, and showcasing all of their talent. And I remember asking Amber this question. And for those who don't know, Amber is another narrator who will be making an appearance on the show very soon. She has an incredible voice. And she said that there are some people who have had like their natural voice. It's almost like, as they say, oh, you have a voice for radio. And sometimes that is the key motivating factor to go into this industry, among many other reasons. However, there have been those, as I said, who have said that we're not in a golden age, but more so that we are entering a pseudo dark age. And the reason I say pseudo dark age is, of course, the rise of AI entering the publishing industry and the narration industry. And a lot of people, viewers and listeners who have been on this show, have given their thoughts and comments to this. Now, Dameon, in your opinion, do you think that we are in a light golden age or semi-renaissance, or would you say, looking at the industry as a whole, we are entering a pseudo AI dark age?
Yes, that is a good question. Because I got an email earlier today from ACX about the use of their artificial voice. So they're offering voice cloning now, and all of
Oh,
the
right.
narrators will know what I'm talking about on that one.
Hmm.
And anybody probably on Threads or anywhere else probably knows what we're talking about. But today there was an email released. Maybe it was released, in batches, but I got it today. So it is here. And it's kind of like, do I think we're in a golden age? Yes, but no. Do I think we're in like a dark age or, where it's like the doom and gloom coming? No, but yes, but also no. Um, I I think that it probably has a place in certain markets, in certain areas.
Right.
And I might catch flack for that one, but there are some things, that, the artificial voice may, unfortunately push people out of work. Just it's it may not be, as cost effective for businesses to use human voices in those aspects. Which is sad to see. I always
Right.
support using human voice, but I don't think it's going to replace a lot of human voices as a whole for
Right.
people that want authenticity. Having an authentic human voice narrate your book is probably the most important aspect from a listener's standpoint, I think. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to hear AI
No.
read a romance book.
No. 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 No.
That's kind of like the area I'm focusing on currently in my career because it's interesting to me. It's a challenge. So that's a lot of my energy and focus right now is around that. So we'll start around that. Nobody wants to hear a romance narrated by a robot.
Mhm.
It's just not
No.
not
No.
not happening. Um,
Very, very true.
yeah, a thriller, probably not on that either.
No.
I mean, there's too much emotion in that. Um, is that my opinion is again, it may have a place in certain aspects, but it's not gonna have I don't think it's valid in anywhere else. Nobody wants to hear it. It affects the golden age, dark age kind of thing right now. Um, the golden age aspect, yes, we are really like there's a lot of audiobooks out there coming out and
Yes.
lots of talented people. Like you've interviewed several narrators and those folks are just like everybody you've mentioned is
Hmm.
amazingly talented. Like I'm just like, wow. I feel like so minuscule standing next to these giants because they're just so talented. And it's
Yeah.
just I see more people coming into the business all the time. Amazingly talented people. And I think it allows authors to have like more choices for voices.
Yes, very true. And before we go on to the business side of being a narrator, there was one last thing I did want to ask you, and I had to go back to my journal to find,
Mhm.
which is this actually was from an author, but I think it also applies to narration. I'm going to add also another thing from a previous episode, which is when talking about AI in particular, this author said, writing is not an indulgence, it's a moral obligation. And the other guest who I had on the show, Mr. Joseph Eisenberg,
Mhm.
when he gave his thoughts on the role of AI in either publishing or narration, AI, ultimately, what it does, it mass produces content.
Mhm.
It may not be the best content, but it mass produces it. And there's a lot of truth to that because for writers, we hone our craft to really make it refined. If you had an AI write a book, as he said, it's like a seventh grader or eighth grader had written it. The quality is going to show.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, Dameon, if you take out writing and replace it with narration, do you think the message is very much the same?
I think the message from both of those folks is spot on. It's exactly the same. Um, Especially when you go in and if you listen to an AI narrated piece, even if it's from something like 11 Labs or whatever they are,
Mhm.
it just is there's something about it that's just not right. And it's like, this is not even close to like first year narrator type
No.
quality. It's like the reverse. And it's just mass produced content. Like my wife will be watching YouTube and I'm like, don't watch that. That's AI voice.
Yes,
Click
there's
on
a lot
pass.
of those.
Yeah, because it's that mass produced content, and it's like you're watching that stuff, and I'm like, you know what? Don't even give them the click. Don't even allow their channel to have that click, because they're using an AI voice. Clearly, it's just mass produced content because that's what people are ingesting right now. And I appreciate all of the authors, especially the authors and the listeners, that choose audiobooks that have human voices,
Yes.
because they're fighting against that mass produced content.
Yes.
And authors are not choosing not to use AI to generate their books. Narrators are choosing to provide their human voices, and authors are choosing the human voice. It's a combined effort to fight that.
Absolutely. And I think that also perfectly segues into the business side of being a narrator, because there's a lot of business behind it. So as a little icebreaker for the business discussion of being a narrator, whenever you're working on a project, and this is going to go back to some of the early questions in the beginning, Dameon, whenever you're working on a new project, of course, the author tells you who the target audience is to help give you an idea of where the book's going, how to say the lines, or how to approach said character. But I am very curious because a lot of narrators, as well as authors, have given their differing answers to this. When you narrate, of course, you're narrating to the author's specific audience, but also, have you talked with an author of possibly marketing towards a different reach as opposed to the standard target audience? And what I mean by that is, just like for authors, how we're supposed to write in particular style to hit those readers, I imagine for narrators, if you are playing a character or you are saying dialogue, you're expected to play this archetype character that's very familiar to the reader, for like veterans of the genre or new people getting into the genre. So I'm wondering, for you as a narrator and a voiceover artist, do you find yourself always pushed towards the market side for the narrator, or have you ever found yourself in some creative leeways to give your performance to the characters, but also play around with getting other people outside of, let's say, romance, fantasy, or thriller to, showcase your talent, but also push the author's work to other reader types?
Yeah, great question. And I was just thinking about a few books I've done this year. Even though it was a romance book, there was like a section where there was like some thriller stuff going on. I wasn't really quite sure. I was pleased because it was one of my first, non-thriller books. I just wrapped up a couple big thriller series books, and I jumped right into that one. And I was able to, act the thriller part. And I don't think that, a lot of folks listening to romances are going to hear that unless they're listening to like thriller romance or something like that.
Right.
Like straight up contemporary romance, probably not going to hear that thriller stuff in that. So I did take the leeway in that one, to the performance. We talked earlier, the narrator has like the permission to perform a certain way. And as long as it's kind of within the general constraints of, what the author intends, it's really, you have the leeway to perform that. So I took that, advantage and performed, more thriller style during that particular chapter. Typically, I try and act along with what's expected in the genre, because from the business aspect, I understand, I know what's going to sell books.
Yes.
To some extent. And that's, people are going to buy the books when it's falling into their preconceived notion of what they think they want to hear in that particular genre. So I don't try and stray too far from that. But I do impart my own flair, if you will, my own
Yeah.
style. And my own style is kind of dark. If you've probably listened to some of my samples on social media. I tend to do more darker sounding things just because that's how my voice is.
Yes.
You know, could I play like a grumpy billionaire? Yes. Could I play a special ops guy in a thriller? Of course. You know, is there some in between, you know, the golden retriever type? Sure, possibly. But generally speaking, you know, those are like the areas I play. And the listeners are going to want to hear that. So it's a fine balance for me in terms of like the business aspect, because I want to make sure that the author gets their books sold.
Yes.
So that I perform in that kind of genre. But I also want to like kind of experiment and like allow people that are not used to listening to that to kind of hear that aspect part of it. It's an interesting question. It's a fine line to walk.
Absolutely. And kind of on the same lines, another fan question is, do you have a favorite moment or piece of dialogue from a book that you've been a part of?
Great question. There are pieces in every book, I think, actually, that always make me say, wow, can't believe I narrated that. That was really cool to narrate. For me, usually the parts that I really enjoy, as a narrator, you know, I want to have the listeners and the author have that like emotional, deep emotional connection
Right.
with the script. And I know a lot of people listen to books. I was talking about this with some narrators and one of my friends that consumes audiobooks as well. And in their mind, when they're listening to the book, it's basically like a movie playing.
Yes.
And as long as you stay in that thin line of, it's like an asymptote. It's just that it's that line that never approaches. As long as you ride that line as close as you can, the listener is going to stay in that moment and be able to experience that movie playing in their head. So part of that is like establishing the deep human connection. Like, and that's probably one reason why I like contemporary romance or any romance for that matter.
Right.
There's always an aspect of a human emotion between the two characters, whoever they are. And I really love that moment, the peak moment in the book, whatever it may be, where they're just like connecting. And when I feel that connection, and I'll tattle on myself again, and probably other narrators know this, when you're crying as a narrator, when you're crying in your booth alone, because you've created that established connection between those characters, that to me is the best feeling ever.
Nice.
And again, it's in every book, you know, it's every book, even thrillers, you know, there's always some intimate connection between two characters in that book. And that's my favorite part.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what's also very important to talk about, another two-part question, which I think really blends together, is that in any industry, it's always good to have people in your corner to help you understand the work a little bit better. And also at the very end of the day, find your voice. Because I think that's the most important thing. Whether you're an author, whether you're an editor, whether you're a narrator, you want to showcase you. You want to showcase who you are. You can learn a lot from other people. You can take classes, you can take seminars, workshops, what have you. But at the end of the day, it is your performance, your work that's going to shine. And it's this balancing act that you have to really understand. For authors, we've always been told, write the book that you want to write. But that's not necessarily true all the time. Because, yes, write the book you want to write. But don't make it so original that it completely confuses the reader. But don't copy and paste from someone else's book and slap your name on it. You don't want to do that. You want to be familiar. Because, as I'm sure you've definitely heard, Dameon, for writers, we are liars, cheaters, and thieves. We make stuff up. We steal from each other and we cheat people out of time. And while that is true, I've always believed in what I call the 3 E's.
Mhm.
Educate, entertain, and enlighten. Because I think you can do that in all manner of genres at the end of the day. And sometimes that's challenging, especially if you want to showcase your work. But as I said before, it's always great to network and connect. So here is the first part of the question, Dameon. How have you been able to balance the two scales? Your individuality as a narrator and as a voiceover artist. And the second part of the question is, in your opinion, how important is it for new narrators getting into this industry to really begin networking and helping them find their voice and hone their narration skills, their voiceover skills in the industry?
Yeah. So how do I balance that in terms of like the individuality? Is kind
Yeah.
of what you're thinking.
Mhm.
Because I consume, so I as a narrator, I still like an author. You probably read other people's works,
Yes.
and it kind of goes back to that, steal everybody else's work kind of a thing. But I wouldn't necessarily say that as a narrator, I'm like doing that, but I am consuming a lot of books as
Right.
much as I can from particular narrators in particular genres,
Mm.
um, so that I can learn and get a different, viewpoint on how to perform that. And it kind of goes back to the previous question of, is performing in that particular for the
Right.
particular market. Um, but I also, I tend to blend those two. Like I tend to take stuff from like the thriller narrators, and I tend to take stuff from the romance narrators, and kind of mix those two together so that it's not necessarily stealing everything, copying verbatim, but there's two of them. There's
Right.
both there. And it's a challenge. And then, for new narrators, in terms of networking,
Yes.
what is what to do? Is that kind of what you're wondering? Or
So I think ultimately the question is, how important is it, like, to really stress that,
Mhm,
like, almost like with authors and editors, if you want to be like a narrator,
mhm.
it's really important to begin networking early in your career.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Um, uh, it's important to not like isolate yourself too much in your recording space. I know it's real easy. A lot of us are introverted or
Mhm.
semi-introverted, so it's real easy to like lock in or lock yourself in your recording space and just not take input from anywhere and just kind of like do your thing. Um, some of the folks out there will know like the bog witch, meaning they just kind of want to just be by themselves in the bog and do all their voices by themselves.
Right.
You can't really isolate yourself that much, because it's important to get feedback from your peers. So it's important
Right.
to network, reach out to people, sign up for classes, hang out in Discord channels or wherever you find people. Go to, if you live in a big enough city, um, attend in-person events that are like put on by the publishers. I think PANA has some, and there's a few others. APA may have some events as well. But attend those events, network, especially as a newer narrator, so you get an idea of how everybody else is working. If you don't, you never could realize your maximum potential, I don't think, because you just don't know what you don't know.
Absolutely.
It's really important, don't lock yourself in. Take classes, learn from those classes, ask questions constantly. Know
Yes.
that everybody, again, we're going to talk about the imposter syndrome. Know that everybody is experiencing that the same,
Mhm. Yes,
whatever level they're at.
100%.
Yeah.
And before we get to the final question, Damien, there is one also very important question that I do want to ask you, because I think it is important to say the power of no. What I mean by that, and the context is, I'm for narrators, I imagine, as you probably mentioned, each narrator has their specific genres of books that they are comfortable narrating in, as well as certain types of scenes or characters. But I've talked with a lot of narrators on the show: Mariana, Sophia, Daphne, and then Amber coming soon. And the thing that really struck me is, as narrators, you guys are probably given a lot of pitches for stories, either before or during. But upon reading, there have probably been some instances where it's like, I don't feel comfortable either saying this dialogue or continuing this story. And that has to be like a very clear boundary and discussion with the author in that particular moment. So another two-part question, Dameon, which I think is very important, is number one, how important is it for narrators to really understand that they have that power to say no to a project if they feel uncomfortable with the source material? And do you have any examples, personal examples, that you like to share to add some further context to this?
Sure. I think this is a great question. So it is probably in the top 5, we'll put it that, as things when you're in running your business, because this is also like a business thing.
Right.
To remember and know that you are running a business, you have the ability to be selective. It's okay to say no to things that you are not comfortable doing. You know, everybody has their thing, their limit. And some genres they test those limits more than others.
Yes.
We'll say that. And it's not necessarily the ones that everybody thinks, because sometimes you'll find like thrillers are probably, they have aspects of romance in them, and they can be pretty testing. So it's okay to say no. Don't get caught up in, especially when you're new or whatnot, because everybody, when you're new, I will say this, when you're new, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying yes to everything, because you just want to build your portfolio as fast as you can. You want to take on as many jobs as you can constantly, book yourself out for a really, really long time. But you have to be selective about that, and say no to the things that are like, part of like what we would say are the trigger warnings,
Right.
or questionable content for you as a narrator. It's okay to say that. Don't go ahead and pass on those jobs if you're not comfortable with it. You get the manuscript. Usually it's audition. You get like a limited portion of the manuscript for the audition. You don't really know what's in the book unless you try and do some digging, and even then you may not know. Feel free to ask the rights holder if you're auditioning on ACX, for example, because that's where most of us get work. If you're not working for like one of the big 5, okay to ask for the manuscript. You could say, hey, I'm interested in auditioning for your book. Can you send me a copy of the manuscript so I can preview it? I just want to make sure that there's nothing in here that I won't be able to read for you. Say no to that. And kind of on that same manner, if you're, don't take jobs that are maybe not as well paying as they should be. If it's not within what you want to do is for your business, it's okay to say no on that. And then to the second portion, there have been books that I've narrated where there were some questionable things for me. It was how I interpreted it.
Right.
And even my co-narrator was like, where I won't narrate. My list of things of not narrating things is pretty small. But for me, it's, anything that harms children or anything like in that realm. And it could be either narrow or it could be pretty wide, but anything that causes any harm, either physically or mentally, to children, I have it's pretty much a hard stop. There was a project I did, and it made me think, that seems a little bit suspect to me. So I reached out to the author and said, hey, this is how I'm interpreting this, when I'm reading this. And I wasn't like in depth reading it, like maybe like a script prep, but I requested the manuscript because it was a dark romance. And I said, hey, can you send me the manuscript? I just want to preview it to make sure I don't see anything in here that I can't read. And they said, sure. So I was reading through it, and to me, when I was skimming it, I'm like, that didn't seem right to me. What's going on here? And I read a little bit further, and I'm like, this kind of like falls into that realm of like potential harm to children. So I went back to the author and I said, hey, this is how I'm interpreting this. I don't think you meant that, but is that what kind of like is going on here? And they were like, oh my gosh, no, that's not at all what I meant. And so they wound up actually rewriting a portion of the book to make sure it was more than abundantly clear that was not the case, that there was no harm to children happening. So
Mm.
it happens. And again, it kind of that second part of that question goes back to the first part where it's okay to say no. It's okay to ask your authors what is going on in this event or situation and ask for the manuscript before you accept the job or even after you accept the job. It's okay to say no and turn the job away. It
Yeah,
happens. It happens.
absolutely. Very, very true. And we now arrive at the final question, Dameon.
All right.
And
More questions. I like the questions.
no problem. So this is a little fun question. We
Mhm.
talked about a lot of things throughout this interview. And I think ultimately what we can take away, especially from the business side of the interview, is that in this industry, just like for authors, there is no guarantee, the project you're going to be a part of is going to be the start of your legacy. That is a very hard pill to swallow, but it's not a get rich quick money scheme. It's a lot of hustling. It's a lot of sometimes freelancing
Yeah.
and really building up your portfolio, because in this industry, just like, for authors and editors, there are two paths: to be a narrator and to be known as a narrator. One is dedicated to the craft, the other is dedicated to the business, and they lead to the same goal at the end. But the objectives in the beginning have to be realistic. And if they're not realistic, that's where a lot of problems are going to come about. And I've talked
Mhm.
about this with, again, Daphne, Sophia, and a lot of other narrators, Mariana, and so forth. I've also talked with a lot of editors on this and authors as well. So here is a little fun scenario, Dameon. Let's say you are hosting a narrator seminar at a convention, let's say in LA or somewhere in the US, and that room is filled with aspiring narrators. Maybe people have worked in some voiceover work for a few years, or people who are completely green and are just getting a lot of research. In that class, what would be, among the many things, the first thing you would teach in that seminar?
That is a great question. I never thought about that one before. We'll have to think about that here. So probably one of the first things I would mention, again, it's within like the top 5 is, saying no, the ability to give yourself to say no. But um, it always for me, it comes back to the imposter syndrome thing. One of the first things I probably would teach is it's okay to have that. It's okay to feel like, you know, you're maybe not as good as you are,
Right.
because you're as good as you are at that moment in time. There's it's you're again, you're on the job that you're on because the author picked you. So
Mm-hmm.
give yourself the grace to accept that. That's I wish somebody would have told me that in the beginning, because I fought with that constantly. Am I good enough? Am I not good enough? Um, there's the performance aspect, there's, the tech aspect. There's so many different things that we have to teach people that are new.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, one of my top things probably is to help people cope and understand that imposter syndrome. Um, if I ever spoke at a convention, I'd probably speak at length on that. It's okay to have those feelings. Everybody does. It doesn't matter if you're a A-list Hollywood performer; they still go through it. I've heard
Yes.
stories of that. It doesn't matter if you're some narrator sitting in their bedroom closet, in the Midwest somewhere, anywhere, in the middle of Alaska, in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin. They all are battling the imposter syndrome. Give yourself the grace to battle that. Stick to it. Don't give up when you feel like your imposter syndrome is beating you down too hard that day. Some days are better than others. We'll just leave it at that.
Absolutely, 100%. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing narrator interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to my friend, Mr. Dameon Knight, for coming on the show and telling us all about some of the projects that he's worked on and his experiences in the industry. Now, Dameon, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out? And do you have any upcoming projects that you would like to share with the viewers and listeners?
Yeah, sure. You guys can probably find me on Instagram, DK Voiceover. That's probably the easiest way. I've got like a bio site that I set up there. It has all my other stuff in it. And then in terms of upcoming projects, like I said, we got Jesse Called My Fiery Opal. That one's currently in production. That's a duet with Daphne Winters. We've got The Knowing Witch by M.M. Parks with Sammy Rowe. Again, I've got another one that's kind of like it's a shifter story going on. I can't really probably like announce it yet, but it's going to be really good. Keep an eye on my social media for that one because there'll be some content related to that. I know a lot of people will enjoy that one.
Awesome. I'll link all those down below in the description of this video. And as I said in the beginning, viewers and listeners, I have a special announcement to make. I talked about this on a previous episode with Daphne Winters, who many of you, if you saw the thumbnail, said she is going to be the voice of Margaret down the road for Michael, Last Angel of Earth. And as a special announcement, and this is going to be a little shock to Dameon here, but after much discussion, I have thought about it, and down the road, I will be making the official audiobook of Michael, Last Angel of Earth. I have said it. It is going to happen. Don't know when, but it'll probably take a few years, but that is fine. It took me about almost 3 years to get the book out. That'll give me enough time to get the rest of the series out. And I've also decided that after listening to Dameon's performances on his social media, that I'm going to make this official right now. Dameon, you are, when it happens, I would like you to play the voice of the main character, Michael, alias Barjan, and Michael, Last Angel of Earth.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That's
awesome.
That's gonna be cool. I'm excited about that now. Thank you,
no
Gabriel.
problem. So you may see some snippets down the road of Dameon reading some dialogue from the book. You may also see some duets with him and Daphne playing their respective characters. There's actually one scene in particular that I will be putting out in the works very soon. So make sure to follow both of us on social media as well as Daphne Winters as well. Until next time, viewers and listeners, again, a huge thank you to my good friend, Mr. Dameon Knight, for coming on the show. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below for this video to stay up to date. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all in the next episode.